So let's put this in motion in terms of doing a movement assessment or biomechanical assessment. And let's talk about the biomechanics of the lacrosse shot. Actually, I've done some work in this area, and it's really interesting to go down this path because there was not a lot of research on the biomechanics shot. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. And, when looking and talking with lacrosse players and coaches, a lot of the questions that would come up would be things like, how do I shoot faster? What shot technique should I use? What do I need to do for strength training? How do I learn how to shoot? All these questions and all these things related to the shot come up. The coach often would ask questions about how to warm up a team or how to warm up a player, and there we look talk about physiology or movements common to the game. I'm going to focus on the lacrosse shot in this presentation. So going back to our movement assessment model, we have these different bullet points we need to consider. We got to state the performance goals. In this case, they want to shoot faster. Obviously, accuracy is a part of that as well, but we'll see a little bit how complex this actually gets. We need to consider the influencing factors. We'll talk about that, understand the movements and the mechanics of what's going on during a lacrosse shot. We got to identify the relevant biomechanical principles. We got to do lots of observation and sometimes qualitative and sometimes quantitative, then do some assessment, evaluation, and then ultimately provide feedback. So lacrosse is a really interesting sport, and it does take a lot of knowledge about figuring out what are the influencing factors when you are talking about a shot, because it's not only just line up and shoot. You're often getting hit with a stick or checked with a body or what have you, and there's a lot of things that can interfere with your ability to shoot. So it's a very dynamic sport. But you have to understand when you look at even trying to understand the biomechanics of a lacrosse shot, you got to understand simple things like field dimensions and player roles. And there's different field dimensions for different levels of play. But this is just an example of a field. We don't have to get into the details with this, but it's also important to understand what rules apply to different positions. And in lacrosse, you have attackers, you have midfielders, and what have you in terms of where they can go on the field. You've got defenders, um, and you've got midfielders in terms of where they can go relative to the defenders and the attackers. So there's a lot of lacrosse IQ that goes into trying to understand ultimately how to get a shot off and who is shooting and how players exchange positions during a game, as well as how they substitute for each other. This all comes into play ultimately with the lacrosse shot as well, in terms of how fresh they are, where they're going to be shooting from, and so forth. So really trying to understand the position responsibilities that lacrosse players are faced with. Obviously, you've got the attackers that are generally the shooting players. They are possessing the ball. They are also playing some defense when the ball is turned over and advancing in their part of the field. They try to stop that ball from even advancing out of their area that they're allowed to go into. Midfielder is responsible for shooting, ball possession as well, advancing the ball as well as defending. They do a lot of face-offs, and then the defender is obviously trying to defend the goal, and not only getting the ball on defense, but then being able to clear the ball to be able to advance their team's attack. So these player responsibilities, obviously I'm giving a broad description of these responsibilities, but it is important to understand these responsibilities. And then you've got to understand some of the equipment that goes into each position, the length of the stick that they have, this type of the shaft head that they have, the way that they string the net onto the head. All these factors will ultimately influence on how well they're able to hold on to the ball, as well as how well they're able to shoot or what kind of shots that they can take. It's good to take a step back and even identify the skills that a lacrosse player has to develop based upon position or based upon overall development, from being able to do face off, be able to pick up the ball off the ground, long pole defense, passing, shooting, and even goalie. Goalie has a whole nother layer of skills that he or she needs to learn. Now, in my world, we start looking at what research is being done, and there is some research on lacrosse, but it's not that deep. And we got into this world probably about 8 years ago, 9 years ago. But there is some epidemiology work in terms of looking at injuries that lacrosse players are faced with, concussions, ankle sprains, knee sprains, and so forth. So, what injuries are happening to players, and trying to understand the equipment that comes into play to minimize the risk of injury or maybe contribute to injury. Equipment, there's been work with different companies on how stiff the shaft should be and how that may play into a lacrosse shot. And then also how the protective gear has developed over years. The helmet, obviously, uh, and pads that they have, goalie gear, especially the type of gloves that they wear, and so forth. There is some research on physiology of lacrosse training, and looking at different types of training programs and how those training programs probably should be tailored for the different positions that are on the on the on the field. So defenders probably need to train differently than attackers, and they both need to probably train differently in some cases of compared to midfielders. And so you really need to think about some of the lacrosse specific movements that are happening and how to strengthen, both, passing and shooting from both sides of the body. And motor behavior skill, being able to learn the lacrosse skills, being able to catch and pass the ball in different positions and different sides and what have you. And then finally, with biomechanics, looking at movement characteristics. And in this work that we initially started, we were really interested in the lacrosse shot, but there's no reason why you couldn't look into face-off skills or ground ball, how to pick up a ground ball while running, that type of skill. All different areas that you could try to assess. So the challenge of looking at a lacrosse shot is there's not one way to do it. There's all different ways to shoot during a game, from a quick stick, shooting in the crease, shooting a perimeter out of the box, an overhand shot, an underhand shot, sidearm, fast break, diving, getting hit, all sorts of things. And so it's interesting when we started looking at this question of how to shoot faster. It's not always the fastness of the shot that makes a player effective. That's one element, one characteristic of a shot. Here's someone lining up to take a shot here and trying to shoot it as fast as possible. But this player here is not really worried so much about velocity, but more so about accuracy and getting it on goal. And this is a quick stick shot where someone passed the ball to the attacker here in front of the net and just needs to shoot as quick as possible, not even worrying so much about speed. So there's all different aspects of a shot. We decided to just take an approach of trying to understand one type of shot and at least go with that. But in order to do that, we actually need to come up with some terminology to refer to the different anatomical parts that are involved with the shot. So we came up with terminology to refer to a top arm, which is the hand that grips the shaft about midway. We call that the top hand, the bottom arm, the lead leg, and the drive leg. And we need to come up with these semantics to describe the different parts of the person, because obviously you have a right-handed shooter, you got a left-handed shooter, and trying to understand what these different parts of the body are doing during a shot is really important. And then we also needed to come up with a model to describe the different movements. Again, part of the movement assessment is coming up with phases and discrete events. So we actually came up with these phases, and then phase is a group of movements. In this case, this is an approach where the person's going to take a series of steps. The discrete event, it happens in a short period of time, like one frame of a video, so the start of a movement. I'll just go through what we came up with. The approach ends when the drive leg contacts. So going back to the drive leg is this leg here, where the drive leg contacts for the shot or contacts the ground for the shot. That ends the approach, and then it would begin. Oh, here's this part of the same phase. Then we would have stick acceleration, and that stick acceleration was defined by the discrete event of top arm maximum flexion, elbow flexion, this part right here. So actually I gotta go back here. Here's this maximum flexion right here. Oh, I've got these out of order, but that's okay. My images should have been lined up a little better. Uh, and then we have, so we have stick acceleration. I've got a better image to make more sense. And stick acceleration goes through from top arm maximum flexion and then ends when the ball is released from the stick. And so those were phases and discrete events. This is a better picture of it. And we actually came up with some other sub phases within the general phase of movement. So and these are the discrete events here. This is not that critical to memorize any of this, but hopefully you get a sense of the movement analysis and what you do to try to get to being able to do some quantitative work or some research. But this is the approach phase. This is the crankback minor, crankback major, stick acceleration phase, a deceleration phase after the ball release, and then a follow through after it even decelerates from there. And these are the discrete events defining each of those phases, or the start and the end point of a phase. All right, so then, okay, so now we're at a point here where we start looking at more of the mechanical principles, biomechanical principles, and we want to improve the shot. So we're looking at measures of success relative to shot speed as well as accuracy. And then the other thing, as I mentioned, quick stick, who's shooting, what position, if it's a defender with a long stick or midi, is it being shot on the run or what have you. But what I want to introduce here is that we also created what's called a deterministic model. And once you have that performance goal, you can start trying to identify some of the things that determine that goal. And so here in this case, we want to determine this shot performance. Speed and accuracy were a couple of things that we identified as important. So here, what determines the shot success? Speed of ball release and accuracy of release. And there's actually some research on this. I'm not going to go through this research, but there's a research related to the ball speed relative to the stick speed. So what happens is in shooting, the stick actually flexes a bit, and then that flex actually acts as like a spring and actually contributes to some ball speed. So the ball is actually going to leave the stick faster than the stick is actually rotating in an angular velocity sense. But these two things determine the shot. Okay, now I've got some other things here. This is just some more work on looking at some of the kinematics of the ball relative to the stick. Let me keep going though, because I want to get to a part of work that we did. Oh yeah, and this is just looking at some additional research on looking at the ability to identify where to shoot and some proprioception skills that players would have. And okay, so speed of ball release is related to the stick angular velocity, stick length, and some ball characteristic actually. And there's some research on ball characteristics. So buying different lacrosse balls, it was determined that they weren't all being made to the same standard. And someone did some research on how well the ball bounced back off the ground, or how what the circumference was of the ball, or even the ball weight varied quite a bit between different styles of balls or different manufacturers of ball. So this is a deterministic model, and what I'm doing is I'm actually working to a part that we did some work on. So looking at what determines speed of ball release, stick angular velocity is one of those factors that determines the speed of the ball release. And now here's some other characteristics that determine stick angular velocity. And there is some work on some of these areas as well. Livingston did some work on one subject looking at shaft design and how that could influence stick angular velocity. But when you start looking at what determines the head of the lacrosse stick characteristics, there's all different things that influence the construction of that stick in the head, from the mesh to the strings to the sidewall, the type of lacing that you have, the style of lacing you have, and so forth. What else is going to ultimately influence the shot? I'm just following this little decision tree down to here. Shaft characteristics, the structure, the material, the shape of it, the texture of it, ultimately the mechanical characteristic of moment of inertia, how easy it is to get it rotating, how hard it is to stop it from rotating. Approach velocity in terms of the shot that we were doing, how fast the person was moving going into the shot was actually a characteristic that would determine ultimately the speed of ball release. And so now a mechanical characteristic that we would look at would be ground reaction forces and friction, cleat design, shoe design, surfaces that these were shots were being taken on. But this is where I wanted to get to. Sorry, I rushed through all that other area. But joint torques, what is going to cause the stick to rotate and ultimately contribute to the speed of the ball and ultimately contribute to the success of the shot will be the joint torques. Lower extremity, knee extensor torques, hip extensor torques, shoulder torques, torque about the elbow, and even the wrist. These are all, and trunk. These are all different joint torques that are going to ultimately influence the shot. We wanted to look at some of the muscle activity that was going on during a shot and some of the kinematics. So we actually did some work in this area of putting on electromyography sensors onto different parts of the body. In this case, we actually started with the forearm muscles. And we wanted to understand what was going on with the forearm muscles during the course of shooting. So we actually did some work on this, and we've got some kinematic data. I won't go into the details of these, but these two lines represent the angular position of the top arm and the bottom arm of the elbow. And so here we were able to determine what the kinematic movements were of the top and the bottom arm with that crosshair right here is where the shot is being made, where the ball is being released. And then we were able to look at some muscles. Actually, I said we start with the forearm muscles. We did do some work with the latissimus dorsi, trying to understand how that muscle, so this y-axis represents how active the muscle is. The x-axis is time. Time 0 represents when the ball released from the shaft. And so here you can start to see where the latissimus dorsi was very active on one side and not so much on the other, or the timing of these muscles was different. So these are left and right sides. And then same thing down here, flexor carpi radialis, looking at how active those muscles were in the shot. And you start seeing some patterns of how muscles are firing relative to when the ball was released. So this was some work that we did, and we actually published some of this. It was really pretty neat to do that. So this is what is called a deterministic model. We identify that key performance that we're interested in this case, the shot, and then we identify ultimately the mechanical characteristics that are contributing to that shot. And then once you do all that, you're able to start identifying where you're going to, in my case, look at what research we're going to look at to try to understand the shot. We can't do all this at the same time. We have to pick different parts to ultimately understand the shot. So we did this work. We were also going to do some work on some shaft characteristics. Unfortunately, we didn't get that work done, but that would have been another line of research. We could have done another line of research on the approach velocity and so forth. In doing all that research, you are able to start identifying what characteristics really contribute to a successful shot. These are just some different projects that have happened at this point. And actually, I had a student do her master's thesis, and she developed a warm-up routine specific to lacrosse, and she did that by identifying all the different movements that they would typically do, and then she was able to identify warm-up skills that would be helpful to get ready for those types of movements. And that's it. All right, so that's an example of doing a movement analysis, ultimately trying to identify some characteristics of a movement and then identify the mechanics behind the movement, ultimately trying to help improve performance. All right, I hope that was helpful.